Minecraft 1.21.5 comes with plenty of new technical capabilities in Datapack version 71 and Resource Pack version 55, like new data-driven mob variants for many mobs, upgrades to set block, fill and clone commands, improvements to text component and SNBT, and much more. My name is SliceSlime and this is a comprehensive guide to the changes. Let's start with commands. The behavior of setBlock and fill has changed when it comes to block entity data. If data is not specified and the existing block has data, that data will be preserved. If you do specify data, the data is now changed to that data. And to clear the data, you can specify empty data. The success or failure of the command now also depends on the block entity data. If either the block state or the block entity data changed as a result of the command, it is now counted as a success. The setBlock, fill, clone, and place template commands also have a new option called strict. If you specify this option, the placement of blocks is done entirely without any block or shape updates. This makes it possible to set impossible states for many blocks that could previously not be set. The fill command now also has a more flexible version of replace, which can be used together with other options. Granting all advancements to the player no longer starts an ear-shattering cavalcade of fanfares that goes on for minutes. The saddle of any mob is now a proper equipment slot, which can be referenced from anywhere that expects an equipment slot, like for the item command. The horse.saddle slot no longer exists. Note that the saddle slot only renders anything for mobs that normally support having saddles, and that adding a saddle to something that can't normally be ridden does not automatically make it rideable. Items in the saddle slot otherwise work like other equipment slots and can have attributes and such. Tamed animals can now be added to teams and will prefer their own team over their owner's team if they are on one. And entities that are not living entities can now be selected using the team selector argument. Let's talk about SNBT. SNBT is the format used in commands and some other places to specify NBT data, a string-based version of NBT. That format gets a big upgrade in this version. To begin with, the format now supports heterogeneous lists anywhere, that is, lists that contain entries of different types. When specifying lists or compounds, you are now allowed to specify one trailing comma. Arrays still require a unified type, but values of smaller types are now also allowed. For instance, it is now valid to list a byte as part of an int array. If the given values for an array do not have type suffixes, they will be read as the same type as the array. Those type suffixes have also been extended. Integer types can now also include an S or a U to signify that the value should be read as signed or unsigned. This only affects the parsing range for those values, so the value is always converted to a signed value after being read. Integer numbers can now be specified in hexadecimal formats by prefixing them with OX, and in binary representation by prefixing them with OB. Starting a number with just 0 is no longer allowed unless the value is exactly 0. When numbers are specified without a suffix, that now has a new default interpretation. If the value is decimal, it is treated as signed. If it is binary or hexadecimal, it is treated as unsigned. Another new function is the ability to use underscores for readability in numbers. Underscores are allowed anywhere in a number except at the very beginning or end, and are simply ignored when the number is parsed. Floating point number formats have been extended as well, where the whole or fraction parts of a float can now be omitted, so both 1 point and 0.1 are valid floats. Float numbers now also support exponential notation, with a lower or uppercase e both being valid to denote the exponent. And note that floating point representations of not a number and infinity are not supported. SNBT input now supports two new operators, bool followed by an argument in parentheses for converting the argument to a boolean value, and UUID followed by a string in parentheses for converting a string form UUID to integer array form. These operators are provided to make it easier to input data from macros. Unquoted strings no longer support starting with 0, periods, or plus or minus signs to distinguish them from numbers. For quoted strings, more escapes are now available, with standard escapes like \n and \t now working, but also including Unicode escapes in both numeric and written out forms. Let's move on to data news. The armor and hand items fields have been merged into an equipment map, which maps equipment slot ID to the equipped item. This equipment field now also supports the new saddle slot, which is now used instead of the saddle item on horse-like mobs and replaces the saddle boolean on pigs and striders. The armor and offhand equipment of players are now stored in the equipment field, just like for other entities. This also means that players now have the other equipment slots like saddle and body, even though it of course isn't shown. The drop chances for items in hand and armor slots are now stored together in an object called drop chances, and instead of this being an array, this is now keyed by slot name. Drop chances that match the default of 0.085 are no longer stored in the entity data. The data field that was previously only available for marker entities is now universally available for all entity types. This is technically considered a custom data component, and the storage for it will at some point in the future be changed when component storage is more properly supported for entities. The field is only written out to data if it's non-empty. A bug has been fixed with many fields that cause them to not disappear when used with the data remove command. For many other fields, there are now default values when they are not present. Some fields have been removed from allays, dolphins, and turtles. The pause, motion, and rotation fields now have to match the exact number of components, but can now be specified in any numeric format. That is to say, you no longer need to specifically force rotation values to be floats. They can also be doubles or ints, but you cannot only specify the first rotation value. Many separate X, Y, and Z fields have been collected into single fields, which are lists of 3 numbers like other positions. This applies for the sleeping position, now called sleeping pause, entered nether position of players, now called entered nether pause, anchor positions of phantoms, now called anchor pause, bound positions of vexes, now called bound pause, the block position of hanging entities, now called block pause, and the home position of turtles, now called home pause. The respawning details of players have also been collected into a single respawn field, with the respawn position additionally replaced with a single subfield called pause. The block state field of falling blocks can now be set to an air-type block, which will cause it to immediately despawn. Omitting the block state or providing an invalid value will cause it to default to sand. For minecart entity types, the custom display tile field has been removed, and the display state field will now always override the default displayed block state if it's specified. The display offset field can now be used regardless of whether there's a custom display state or not. The block state data of arrows, minecarts, block displays held by endermen, falling blocks, primed TNT, or piston moving blocks are no longer allowed to be specified as empty. And some field renames. The has egg field of turtles has been renamed to has egg in snake case. The size field of phantoms has been renamed to lowercase. The life text field of vexes has been renamed to lowercase snake case as well. Many fields have been fixed to properly get reverted to their default values when removed with the data command. Overall, many fields in different entity types and block entity types now get the same default value when set with a command as when placed into the world by a player. A change to the owner field of tamed mobs. That is no longer restricted to being a player, but can instead be any living entity type. And the fall distance field has been changed from a float into a double value and renamed into snake case fall distance. Display entities no longer use the interpolation duration value for their teleport duration. For item displays, the first person left hand and third person left hand transforms are now rendered the same as when the item is held in that hand. And item frames now always save the rotation and item drop chance, regardless of whether there's an item in them or not. The potion entity type has been split into splash potion and lingering potion. The default value of the duration field of area effect clouds has been changed to -1, which means area effect clouds summoned without a specific duration no longer vanish instantly. For a cloud with -1 as duration, they will instead never expire. Area effect clouds now have a new field called Potion Duration Scale. If not specified, the default is 1, and the duration of the potion effect that is inflicted is multiplied by this number. Any area effect cloud created by lingering potions will have this value set to 0.25. That neatly leads us into changes to item components, where there's now also a new Potion Duration Scale component, which is a non-negative float value. When that component is present on any item that has potion contents, the potion duration is scaled by this factor. This also applies to the custom effects in the potion contents. There's another new component, which is the weapon component. When present on an item, that means the item used statistic for the item increases from punching something with the item. Attack with the weapon also takes durability from the item according to the item damage per attack field, which is damage to the item, not damage from the attack. Attack damage is an attribute modifier that already existed. There's also a disable blocking for seconds field, a non-negative float which defaults to 0. If this is set to a positive value, it will disable blocking on a successful hit for the specified number of seconds. There's a new component called blocks attacks. When this is present on an item, that item can be used like a shield to block damage from attacks. The damage reduction from blocking is specified in a damage reductions field, which is a list of entries that control how much damage should be blocked in a given attack. Each entry can specify which type of damage it applies to in the type field, either as a damage type ID, list of damage type IDs, or hashtagged damage type tag. If not specified, this damage reduction entry applies to all types of damage. Each damage reduction entry in the component can also have a horizontal blocking angle, which specifies the maximum horizontal angle between the player facing and the direction to the attack for the blocking to be effective. The default value is 90 degrees. If the blocked damage has no position, such as for environmental damage, that will be treated as if the damage came from directly behind the attacked entity. The amount of damage to block is specified in the two fields base and factor, where base specifies an absolute amount of damage to always block, and factor specifies a fraction of incoming damage to block. This factor is applied on top of the base, so a blocking item with a base of 5 and factor of 0.5 will block all incoming damage for an attack of 10 and 15 damage out of an attack of 20. It has an optional bypassed by field that specifies a hash prefixed damage type tag. If that is present, that type of damage cannot be blocked by this item. The item damage field controls how the item takes damage from blocking. This is an optional object, and if not specified, a single point of durability is used up by every block. If specified, it has 3 fields. Threshold for the amount of damage that the attack needs to deal before the item takes damage, and then a base value for the amount of damage the item always takes, and a factor field for a fraction of damage depending on the attack value. The block delay seconds field is a non-negative float that determines how long time it takes to activate the block in seconds. If not specified, this defaults to 0. Disable cooldown scale is a multiplier to the time the item gets disabled when hit by a disabling attack. This defaults to 1, and if set to 0, that means the item cannot be disabled by attacks at all. Block sound specifies the ID of the sound event to use when an attack is blocked. And disabled sound specifies the ID of the sound event to use when blocking is disabled by an attack. The tool component now also has a new field, can destroy blocks in creative, which defaults to true but can be set to false to make tools not destroy blocks in creative mode. There's a new break sound component which can be used to specify the sound that the item makes when it runs out of durability and breaks. If this is not present, no sound will be played, but by default this component is present on all items. The new provides banner pattern component can be used to make items enable certain patterns in a loom. The format is a hashtag banner pattern tag. The provides trim material component makes an item provide a specified trim material when used in a trimming recipe. The trim material registry entries no longer specify items. Note that to be used in the built-in smithing recipes, your item also needs to be added to the trim materials item tag. A set of new entity variant components have been added to configure aspects of appearance for mobs related to the items. These components are applied to the entity when used with any item that spawns an entity, like spawn eggs, paintings, and fish buckets. These components include variant components for villagers, wolves, foxes, parrots, mushrooms, rabbits, pigs, frogs, horses, llamas, axolotls, cats, and paintings. There are also color components for sheep and shulkers, as well as color components for cats and wolves. For tropical fish, there are 3 components for pattern, base color, and pattern color, and for salmon, there is a single size component. There's a new wolf/sound variant entity component that can be set on wolf spawn eggs. Woof. These components are now used by items from the creative inventory. Note that currently these components do not get set when using pick block to get a spawn egg. There are also other component changes. The equipable component can now also apply to the saddle slot and has a new Boolean field called equipOnInteraction, which determines if the item can be equipped on a mob by interacting with it. This only works if the target mob doesn't already have an item in the relevant slot. If not specified, the default value is false. The body slot is no longer special, and as long as the equipable component has it set and the allowed entities field matches, the equipment can now be added into that slot. The dyed color component format now also supports specifying RGB color components in a list similar to other color fields. The hide tooltip and hide additional tooltip components, along with all the show in tooltip fields in various components, have been removed. Instead, there is a new tooltip display component. This component controls the display of tooltips with a hide tooltip boolean field that can be used to hide the tooltip entirely, and a hidden components field, which is a list of all the components to hide tooltips from. These can include all the components that previously had show in tooltip booleans, but also a number of new components that take over the roles of hide additional tooltip flags from before. The components that previously had one main field and an optional show in tooltip boolean have been reduced to their simplified form. So while you could previously choose to omit the levels field for enchantments components, that simplified form is now the only way to write that component. These tooltip changes also have effect on other formats. For loot tables, the toggle tooltips function now accepts any item component ID in the toggles map, and that component will be toggled in the tooltip display component. Entity predicates now have a new optional field called components. This field matches components on entities, which for now only include the entity variant components, and those components are not actually stored as components the same way as on items. The format is the same as components on item predicates, and in the same way, these component predicates are an exact match against the full component data. A number of previous sub-predicates have now been replaced by these new component matches. Entity predicates now also have an optional field called Predicates for using component predicates to do non-exact matching. Block predicates now also have the same two fields of components for exact matches and predicates for partial matches of block entity components. And the stepping on location predicate in entity predicates can now only succeed if the entity is on the ground. In recipe news, crafting transmute recipes have been changed, and the result field now also supports specifying a count and a components patch to apply to the result. That patch is applied to the final transmuted item. For simple items, the item ID can still be used as before. Smithing recipes have been updated. The base field of transform recipes is no longer optional, and the base, template, and addition fields in trim recipes are no longer optional. These recipes now also have a pattern field specifying the trim pattern that will be applied, which means that pattern is no longer specified in the trim pattern registry. The way variants are defined has been unified in this version, with variants now generally having a spawn conditions field and an asset definition either as a single asset ID field or an assets object with multiple entries. Variant selection is now done the same way for all data-driven variants, with a priority and condition available for each variant. When a mob spawns, the position is used to filter all the variants based on their conditions, and then the one with the highest priority is selected, or a random one of those if there are more than one. There are 3 possible spawn conditions. Biome checks if the entity is spawning in a wanted biome. The matching biomes are specified in a biomes field, which is either a biome ID, list of biome IDs, or a hashtag biome tag. Structures checks if the entity is spawning inside a specific structure, given by a structures field, which is a structure ID, list of structure IDs, or hashtag structure tag. And finally, the moon brightness condition matches the brightness of the moon with a range given by the range field, which is either a single floating point value or a min-max object. There are now data-driven cat variants in the game, which can be modified by adding files in the cat variant registry folder. Each variant has a spawn conditions field like we just discussed, and an asset ID field which references the texture asset to use for that variant. Frog variants are now similarly data-driven through the frog variant registry with exactly the same fields. Of course, the asset ID in this case now references a frog texture. And wolf variants have been similarly changed to use spawn conditions, but the multiple textures of the wolf are now found inside an assets object and renamed to not use _texture suffixes. There are also new registries for pig, cow and chicken variants. These variants have an extra model field which specifies which model to use, one of normal and cold for pigs and chickens, and one of normal, cold and warm for cows. There's currently no corresponding data driving of eggs, however, although egg laying is controlled through the gameplay/chicken lay loot table, which means that you can modify it to have custom variants lay custom items. By default, only the built-in chicken variants lay any eggs at all. Wolf sound variants can now be data-driven through a new registry folder called Wolf Sound Variant. Each file in there contains sound event references for ambient death, growl, hurt, pant, and whine sounds. As usual with sound events, keep in mind that custom sound events need an inline format to work. There are two new game rules in this version. Let's start with allow fire ticks away from player. When set to true, fire ticks are allowed to happen anywhere in simulation distance or in chunk-loaded areas. When false, fire ticks are only allowed within 8 chunks distance from a player. There's also a port from Bedrock Edition called TNT Explodes that controls whether TNT can be set off and explode. When the game rule is off, TNT cannot be primed by any means, and trying to do so directly, like with the flint and steel, will show a message on the action bar. When the game rule is off, powering a TNT block with redstone does nothing, and blowing it up with an explosion causes it to vanish. A TNT block on fire can burn up as if it was a plank. Trying to dispense it will fail. In advancement news, the background field no longer has a textures prefix or .png suffix, and now works like other asset IDs. There are new particles in this version. There's a new particle type called Tinted Leaves. It has a color parameter, which is the standard RGBA format of either a packed integer or a list of 4 floats. And the Firefly particle, which is a default particle without any parameters. Let's talk about text components. Text component arguments to the boss bar, scoreboard, and team commands now resolve their components, so you can use context-dependent components. The referenced context is the current entity, @s. The format of text components have changed everywhere in the game. In commands like tellraw, title, and scoreboard, they are now specified as SNBT instead of JSON. When stored in data, text components are no longer stored as JSON inside strings and are instead stored as actual data. The format is the same as before, but not inside a string. When using the NBT type and having the interpret flag set to true, the text component will now be parsed directly from the given NBT instead of converted to a string and interpreted as JSON. There are also changes to hover events. Hover event is now written as snake case instead of camel case, and the legacy value field is no longer supported. For show text actions, the contents field is now called value. For the show item and show entity actions, the contents field has been inlined. In the show item case, when the contents was previously an item ID, that is now written in the ID field instead. And for show entity actions, the ID field is now called UUID, and the type field is now called ID. Click events have also changed, with click event also written in snake case rather than camel case. For run and suggest command actions, the command is now set in a command field rather than value. For run command, the command no longer needs a prefixed slash, but will now always be interpreted as a command regardless. The open URL action target URL is now specified as URL instead of value. And for change page actions, the page number is now specified as page rather than value, and now requires a positive integer rather than a number specified as a string. In tag news, there are new biome tags for spawns cold variant farm animals and spawns warm variant farm animals. A new item tag, book cloning target, for any items that can be used with a written book to duplicate it. And there's a new eggs item tag for all the chicken eggs. New block tags, replaceable by mushrooms for blocks that can be replaced by mushroom blocks when a big mushroom grows. And sword instantly mines for blocks that get instantly mined by swords. There's a new block tag called Place Ambient Desert Block Sounds, which, contrary to its name, does not control which blocks play those sounds, but rather which blocks must be under a dead bush to make it play its ambient sounds, and which blocks need to be 8 blocks horizontally from a sand or terracotta block to make them play their ambient sounds. There's a new block tag for camels spawnable on. The edible for sheep block tag now controls which blocks sheep can eat that get completely consumed, like short, dry, and moist grass. The dead bush may place on block tag has been renamed to dry vegetation may place on. There's a new entity type tag called can equip saddle for entities that can be interacted with to equip a saddle. And the entity type tag can wear horse armor has been added. And a set of new structure tags for which structures appear on the maps sold by cartographers from different villager types. These were previously only used when the villager trade rebalance experiment was turned on. The cat variant tags default spawns and full moon spawns have been removed. Structure blocks also have a new option for strict placement, which does just the same thing as it does for the commands. A custom world change in this version. There's a new field in the biome effects called dry foliage color. Like for the other tint overrides like grass color, this can be used to set a specific color for the dry foliage tint in the biome. This pack version also introduces the Minecraft gameplay test system. This is a system for automatic test cases of the way the game behaves. Every test case is an individual structure meant to run in isolation and test that something happens. This system is accessible to both data packs and mods with different interfaces. It is much more flexible to use from code. A gameplay test is a combination of a test structure and a test instance asset. For code-based tests, this asset also points out how to access the right code to drive the test. When a test runs, the structure is loaded in and the corresponding code is run, if there is any. Each test is represented by an asset in the test instance registry. These assets have a number of entries describing how long the test should run and the circumstances of how they should run. The test instance also has a type which is one of function and block-based, where function tests require some function to be added in code, and block-based tests run entirely using blocks in the test structure. The test instance asset also describes which structure to use with a namespace ID and the namespace ID of a test environment, which we'll get into later. For block-based tests, the structure is expected to contain at least 2 of a new type of block, the test block. This block has 4 different modes: start, log, fail, and accept. Each test is required to have at least a start and an accept block. When the test starts, the start block emits a single-tick redstone pulse. All the other block types are redstone receptors and perform some action related to the test when they trigger, logging a message to the game log, failing the test with a given message, or successfully completing the test. For code-based tests, instead of using test blocks, the mod is expected to add a test loader to the game, which adds test functions. Each test function is a method that accepts a game test helper instance in official mapping terms. That helper can be used to do many things, including summoning mobs and items, summoning mobs without their AI enabled, making mobs walk to certain places, and so on. The helper also has methods for asserting about the development of the state in the test, and support for making sequences of events and requirements. Each test also runs in a test environment. An environment is basically a set of global conditions like the time of day, weather, and game rules. A test environment is added to the test environment registry and is a typed object that can do things like set game rules, weather, time of day, or more generally, run command functions for setup and teardown. When any test is started, the setup and teardown of the environment is applied to make sure that the test has the right conditions to run. To create a test, start by creating a data pack with the test instance asset and any environment it needs. You can then enter the game and use a new command called test. This command has a number of options, but to begin with, the test create subcommand is used to set up a new test. Use it with the ID of your test instance to create a setup in the world with size of the text structure in the following arguments. Note that this is meant for running in a flat world and will nuke a piece of the world around you to place the setup. This gives you a test instance block and a structure space with the bottom of Bedrock and visible outline. Interact with the test instance block to view or manipulate the settings for the test. This allows you to save the test structure, reset the state and load it back in, as well as changing the size and settings of the structure. After building and saving the test structure, you can also run the test by interacting with this block and hitting the Run Test button, or by using the test command again with the Run Closest subcommand. The test command also has more functionality for running one or more tests that already exist without having to load them in one by one. Running tests this way is one way to run them, but the server jar now also has a new entry point that can be used to start an automated run of tests. This can be used for fully automated test runs like what is wanted on CI systems. This creates a super flat world and runs all the tests in the provided pack. And with that, we're going to leave the test framework and move on to resource packs. Blocks can now be tinted based on a dry foliage map, and the color map texture for that tinting has also been added. There's a new property for select item models called Component. This matches the content of an item component, so for instance you can compare the contents of the item's name or the variant name of a painting. As opposed to all existing properties for the select item models, the expected format of cases is whatever the data is for that component type, which might not be a string. There's also a new component boolean item property for the condition model type. This property checks for an item component predicate the same way they can be used for commands, but instead of using the predicate type as a key name, it is specified in the predicates field, and the predicate itself is specified in the value field. When an item entity is on the ground, the model size is now taken into account when determining the bobbing motion. This means item models no longer clip through the ground regardless of their size. The way items in a stack are rendered has also changed to take the size and type of the model into account. And equipment assets can now also define saddle-related layer types. Saddle textures are now outside of camel and horse textures, and the pig and strider saddle textures have changed as well. Equipment layers configured to be dyeable will now show if the item has the dyed color component, regardless of if that item is in the dyeable tag or not. The pig texture has been renamed to Temperate Pig. The old chicken texture has been renamed to Temperate Chicken and moved into the chicken folder. The cow texture has been renamed to Temperate Cow and new ones have been added. The size and UV mapping of the cow, mushroom and pig textures have also changed. Sheep now have a separate texture for their wool undercoat, which, like the wool texture, is dynamically recolored by the game. The sheep fur texture has been renamed to Sheep Wool. There are new icon textures for all the spawn eggs, and the old spawn egg texture split into base and spot overlays have been removed. The Enchanted Glint entity texture has been renamed to Enchanted Glint Armor. Some of the wolf sound files have moved into the classic folder, and the unused howl sound has been removed. In shader news, shader program definitions for core shaders and post-processing effects as JSON files have been removed. The shader programs themselves are still available as files that can be overridden in packs, but note that overriding core shaders is currently considered unsupported and may break in any future version. Post-processing effects are still configurable as JSON files. In these, the program field has been replaced with vertex shader and fragment shader fields. The type field is now required for all uniforms. And there's new functionality for shaders, where global uniforms can now be defined in any shader, and the game will attempt to fill it for a known list of matching uniforms shown on screen now. And that's all for this time. Thank you for watching. If you appreciate these technical videos, please do drop a like and maybe even a comment. They take an enormous effort to make, so I'd really appreciate the support. My name is Sliced Lime, and I'll see you next time.